Hello. In this video, we are going to expand our ideas about what global communication means by thinking outside of just the language that we speak and thinking about culture. Now, culture is unavoidable, it's everywhere. So if we think about what do these things show us about culture? So, for example, popular music, pop music. What does it tell us about a culture? Well, it tells us what is important in a culture. So, how does a singer or singers look? It tells us what is taboo about a culture. So, for example, a lot of music aimed at younger people wants to push the boundaries of what is tolerated in a society. And so, therefore, it kind of reveals that to us. So, if we think of punk music, and I mean punk in the original sense before it was a corporate thing, but the original punk of the late 70s showed us what was dangerous. Or if we think of gangster rap from the early 1990s, that showed us what was taboo in a society, what was pushing the cultural boundaries. But not just that, we can think of, for example, traditional clothing. So what does the traditional clothing of a culture tell us about that culture? So, for example, is it bright? Is it heavy material? Is it light material? Do the clothes fit the body very tightly, or are the clothes very baggy, very loose? And that can tell us a lot of things. It can tell us about the climate of a country, or a culture, I should say. It can tell us about how comfortable a culture is with showing the body, with revealing a body shape. And even the classroom. What does a classroom look like? What does education look like in that culture? Is it a one-way teaching system? Or is it very much two-way or multiple ways where every student is speaking to other students? Even things like fashion, and again, we can connect this to pop music or pop culture in general, popular culture. What is considered smart clothes? What are casual clothes? Do people dye their hair? Do they color their hair? Do they show skin, or do they cover up? And also from this picture, we can think about marketing or advertising. How do companies appeal to a culture? So in this case, if we're looking at this picture, that the person is showing what a culture might consider success. An expensive suit in what looks like an expensive place. It is giving the idea that this is success. And so if a culture believes that financial success is the most important thing, then that's what we will see in advertising, but also what we will see in fashion. We can think about physical things also. So, for example, distance. How close do you stand to the person who you are speaking to? Do you point with a finger, or do you point with all your fingers together, kind of as an open palm? How do you greet somebody? Do you shake their hand? Are you touching them? Do you give a kiss on a cheek? How many times? Or do you bow? Is there no contact at all? Is it completely separate? Do you make eye contact? Do you not make eye contact? So these are all very, very culturally specific things. And something else that really reveals culture is the entertainment. So, for example, movies. Is it all about male heroes? Is it all about one person? Does one person save the day, or is it a group of people? Is it about solving things with violence, or is it solving things through debate, through discussion? What does it reveal about attitudes to authority? Is an authority figure trusted or not trusted? So really, everything in a society reveals something about that culture. So we can really analyze everything about an item of clothing, or the way people speak to each other, how close they stand, the kind of media that is popular, the kind of fashion that is popular, the way that their education system, the news, what is in magazines, that kind of thing. Everything is revealing what is important or what is taboo in that culture. So let's take the idea of the classroom and think about what does it show us about education, seeing as, this is the context that we are speaking in. So let's think about education then. What does that mean? So if we think about how 3 different classrooms could have their seating arrangement. Okay, so we've got 3 here, so top left, top right, and on the bottom. So we could have rows of single desks. We could have rows of 2 desks together, like in the top right. Or we could have groups of 4 desks together, so 4 students sitting around 6 different desks in this case. So if we think about what does this show us about the education culture? Well, firstly, let's look at the grid. So the teacher's desk is at the front, so we can imagine that the board is also at the front as well. So what it's showing is, in this culture, there is not much interaction between the students. That the teacher is at the front of the class and all eyes are on the teacher. So what this reveals about a culture is the class is what we can call teacher-centered. It's like teacher-focused. The students are simply there to absorb what the teacher says. So it's really very much a one-way education experience. And we can see that simply from how the desks are arranged. If we look at the second example, well, we can see they're in rows of 2. So this might be familiar to you. But again, we're facing the teacher. All eyes are at the front. So the idea that the teacher is the provider of knowledge. In this kind of arrangement, there may be some pair work. So students may work with the person sitting next to them. But essentially, they are still facing forward, listening to the teacher, with maybe some partner work included. But again, the teacher is the provider of knowledge. if we think of this kind of arrangement, so students are in groups. So already from the beginning, they are not simply facing the direction of the teacher. So we can guess from this arrangement that there is a lot more group work. So perhaps there's a lot more debating happening, a lot more discussion, a lot more self-discovery of information. The teacher may set some tasks to do, and the students have to discover that information just for themselves. So even something as simple as the arrangement of tables or desks in a classroom really reveals something about the education culture of that school or that society. How important is the teacher? Is the teacher the provider of knowledge that students simply write down what they're saying? Or is the teacher guiding the students to discover the information for themselves? So really, everything in a society really reveals something about a culture. So it doesn't matter if it's clothing, greetings, physical distance, the advertising. Everything is really based on what is important to that culture, or what that culture finds interesting or disgusting or enticing or inspirational, aspirational. But this is very much a perception thing. So for example, take a look at this picture and just take a moment and think, what is happening in this picture? Again, you might think they are arguing. You might think the person on the left is trying to give the person on the right some money, but that person is kind of declining. You may think the person on the left is asking for directions and the person on the right is giving directions. Maybe she has an address written on a piece of paper. Let's have a look at another one, see what you think. Okay, one more, see what you think. Now, I'm sure everybody watching this video probably thought something different about every single photo. And this is for a very good reason, that our perception is surprisingly individual. Even if you think, oh, well, I am from my country's culture, so therefore I think like this. Well, actually, perception is surprisingly individual. So we can think of things as, it's very difficult to find a truth. So something that is important, something that is attractive, something that is disgusting, repulsive. This very much depends on person to person. So we can see that the truth is very much about the direction that you see it from, the perception that you have. And this perception basically comes from every single interaction, every single experience you have ever had. And whilst we like to think of ourselves as coming from a specific culture and therefore having the values of that culture, well, it's actually a lot more individual than we like to think. So, connecting this to language, think about this question for a second. So, if you know all of the words and the grammar in a language, let's say a second language, not your own language, do you know how to communicate with others? So why or why not? Okay, so just have a think about that for a second. So personally, I would say not. You don't really know how to communicate with others. And this is one of the problems with learning a language simply through translation or simply through learning lists of vocabulary, lists of words, because communication is not grammar and communication is not vocab. The grammar is simply an arbitrary order that words have evolved into. And whilst it's important to a certain extent that it would be extremely confusing to put words in a random order, it's not the only thing that affects communication. And similarly with vocabulary. Simply knowing a lot of vocabulary does not make you a good communicator. Now, the meaning of language is absolutely in vocabulary. So you could argue that vocab is in fact more important than grammar for communication. However, these are simply pieces, these are simply foundations of communication. So I could compare this to, because you know a scale on an instrument, maybe it's a major scale or it's a minor scale or it's a modal or it's a pentatonic, that doesn't make you a composer. Just because you can read music, you know which line is which notes and you know what the spaces are, does not make you a composer. A composer is able to use that knowledge, but to combine it in a way that communicates something. It communicates a feeling. So we can really compare this to language and culture, that simply translating word for word from your first language into a second language actually is not really communication. In fact, trying to communicate in that way, simply translating, often becomes more confusing to the other person. So we can refer to this as what's known as global competence. And we can think of that as being like an interpersonal communication. And there are certain elements to this, certain rules, or certain guidelines, let's say. So speaking in a language that is not your first language, let's say. So you're speaking to another person, maybe, let's say, for argument's sake, let's say English. So you're speaking English and you're speaking to another person. Maybe English is their second language also. Maybe it's their native language, but easily could be, in fact, it's more likely to be their second language if you're communicating. So interpersonal communication, well, we've got to start by communicating in the same language. Of course, we can communicate physically through gestures and things like that. However, there is a limit to how much you can communicate with that. It's very difficult to have a conversation simply through gestures. We can communicate things like being lost or needing a new glass in a restaurant, or wanting the menu or the bill. These are kind of very simple commands almost, or requests. However, actually having a conversation, well, really you both need to speak the same language to some degree. Interact with awareness, empathy, and knowledge of the perspectives of others. So this means that you are very self-aware, that you realize that your perception, just like the circle and square picture from a few minutes ago, your perception is not the only perception. It is not a truth. It is simply a perception. And so having empathy about that, realizing that other people might feel different, is a really important part of interpersonal communication. What comes with that is not being judgmental. Realizing that your perspectives compare to other people. So for example, if you are in a culture that has very little physical contact, and you meet somebody who, when they greet you, they try to kiss your cheek, maybe multiple times, you might not like it, and that's fine, but you're not judging that person as being a bad person. You just realize that, okay, they're doing something which is very normal for them, but you don't like it, and that's okay. But the other person is not a bad person. They're simply doing what is normal for them. And that means being alert, being aware of cultural differences, including noticing cues, so noticing kind of signals, we can think of that, indicating miscommunication or inappropriate action. So, for example, somebody's reaction to something that you do or something that you say, being aware of their reaction and being sensitive to that. And again, in a non-judgmental way, but realizing, okay, so what I'm doing is making this person uncomfortable or making this person confused. So, also, acting respectfully. So according to what's appropriate in the culture or the situation where everyone is not from the same background. Now, that could be that you are the only person not from that background, or it could be that everybody in that situation is from a different background. And again, acting respectfully. And I think really this one is a combination of the others, being aware of their reactions and miscommunications, not being judgmental, having empathy, realizing that your perspective is simply that, it is your perspective. And increasing your knowledge about the products, the practices, the perspectives of other cultures. Now, what this does not mean is, to have interpersonal communication, to be globally competent, you must learn every single culture from around the world. That's the only way to do it. No, not at all. But it is about that empathy, about that awareness. And of course, you can learn specific cultures through interaction. But just increasing awareness of it, it's a key part. Okay, seeing more than just the society or culture that you grew up in. Now, this totally connects to language, because language and culture are interconnected. In fact, you could argue that language and culture are impossible to separate. And we can see language in culture from, for example, how you refer to other people. Do you call your teacher by their first name, or do you call them by their married title, like Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. or Miss? Or do you call them by their job title? Do you call them teacher or professor? And again, that is language, and it is culture, that you cannot separate them out. So this is the end of the first video on culture. So in the next video, we'll be looking at how the components of culture can be broken down. So thank you for listening and watching.